Hey everybody, this is the 80s Slasher Librarian. I'm sorry I was only able to drop one chapter last night. I know I said I would put out 3 today, but because of some personal issues, I'm only going to be able to do 2 chapters like normal. I do apologize for that. It is a medical situation. But here we go. Jason X, The Experiment by Pat Cadigan, Chapter 5. Olsen announced that they would take their coffee and dessert at the foot of the indoor waterfall. He assured Lynn that she was going to love it as he ushered her inside. It just happened to be right next door to one of the plant's half-dozen Zen rock gardens, which he was also delighted to show her. And these were only a few of the marvelous on-site features that existed purely for the benefit and pleasure of the employees. All employees, of course, from the highest to the lowest, were given equal access, as recommended by those brilliant and insightful folks who made up the human needs team. He kept up the guided tour commentary without a break for the 5 minutes it took for them to get from the roof garden to the waterfall, although what Lynn heard didn't sound as much like commentary as it did sales patter. The enthusiasm in his voice certainly seemed genuine enough, and when she saw the waterfall, she understood why. It was a spectacular creation, about 40 feet of carefully carved, slightly glittery stone with enough of a slope so that the water didn't thunder down, but trickled and danced along several separate routes into the fish pond at the bottom. But she could also hear a faint underlying urgency, as if he were literally trying to sell her the power station, or at least this part of it, and he had to talk her into it today if he wanted to keep his job. It was irritating, although Lynn had to admit the ambience produced by the waterfall tempered her disagreeable feelings considerably, which, of course, must have had a great deal to do with why he had brought her here in the first place. Too bad for him that he didn't realize he was trying too hard. In any case, Lynn wished he would drop the pretense that he had brought her here just to see this, and not because the situation they supposedly weren't in had turned into something serious enough to warrant sending armed guards down to the lake. Or perhaps he really believed he had managed to usher her back inside before she had had a chance to see them moving down the grass with their weapons up and ready. Tables and chairs had been set up along the wrought iron fence around the edge of the pool. Olsen kept chattering away, pointing out the gates at either end of the fence. There was actually a kind of staircase built into the rock. If she looked closer, she would see the steps. They began right over there. Did she see them? So any lucky employee who felt the urge could actually climb up to the top of the waterfall, which was where one of the Zen gardens was located. While Olsen was telling her all this, 2 men dressed like high-class waiters appeared out of nowhere with a coffee service cart, served the 4 of them in silence, and vanished again without causing him to miss a syllable. Lynn tried to catch Shabaz's eye, but he had positioned his chair in such a way that he was facing the waterfall and could not look in her direction easily. Kai followed his example, making Lynn wonder why the 2 of them didn't just offer the old gotta-get-back-to-work excuse and leave. Maybe they actually were here for the waterfall, she thought, looking around. Unbidden, it suddenly came to her that there were no windows here. No windows and no sound other than the pleasant white noise of the water and underneath it. A nearly inaudible hum from the ventilation system, or possibly a water pump. Soundproof, she said. Olsen broke off and stared at her, mystified. Pardon? I said soundproof. She looked back at him evenly. This place is soundproof, and I don't see any windows either. Is it also airtight by any chance? The man floundered, finally at a loss of something to say. I don't suppose I could persuade you to give me an update on that situation that we weren't in earlier, could I? She asked. Olsen now looked thoughtful, and she wasn't sure if he were trying to choose his words or if he were listening to someone giving him instructions by way of his communication link. Well, to be honest, I'm still waiting for an update from the head of security myself. His smile was a bit sheepish. I'm the boss, except when it comes to protecting the power station. Then he is, and he runs everything on a need-to-know basis. Lynn nodded politely. Go on. The man spread his hands. I'm afraid that's really all I can tell you. Other than that, we already know there's an intruder or intruders in the woods, and whoever it is seems to be displaying hostile intent. How? Lynn prodded. Sorry. Olsen spread his hands again. Need to know. And your security chief doesn't think you need to know? Afraid not. Tell me something, Doc. She leaned forward over the table and put her hand over his firmly enough to trap it. If your security chief did think you needed to know, that wouldn't mean you'd think I needed to know, right? Olson blinked, his expression neutral. More coffee? While Lynn had caught a glimpse of a small armed detail of guards heading towards the wooded area around Veronica Lake, Olson had succeeded in getting her off the roof before she saw the van. If she had seen it, the level of her anxiety might have gone up substantially. It was actually just a classic paddy wagon-style van, reinforced with the very best and most expensive lightweight, blast-proof armor that nanotech manufacturing could produce, meant to transport personnel and weapons or, in classic paddy wagon style, anyone taken into custody. There had been half a dozen more guards in the back of the van, which took them all the way down to the edge of the woods. The young lieutenant behind the wheel remained in the driver's seat with the engine on standby, one weapon in easy reach of her left hand and another on the seat next to her, pointed at the open passenger side door. Rena Sophira had muted her comlink in favor of the dashboard speaker. The multiple voices she heard weren't synchronized with the images rotating every few seconds on the small flat screen just below it, but she wasn't paying much attention to the screen. She was much more concerned with what she might see coming toward her out of the woods. Cosgrove's orders to round up the demonstrators had come through with a close-up of a guy's head on a stick. Of course, the demonstrators didn't want to go quietly. She had been sorely tempted to show them their friend's new headshot, as it were, but Cosgrove would have had her head on a stick. So they were forced to use the standard and more impersonal method of persuasion. Privately, Sophira thought the picture would have made them all move a lot faster and with a lot more cooperation than the stingers had. They were demonstrators, for God's sake, soldiers of conscience. Responding to psychology was how they lived. It was behind everything which they did. Giving them painful, though non-lethal, electric shocks with a wand would only make them hysterical and even more difficult to handle. She sighed. Cosgrove wasn't a stupid man, but he sure had some blind spots. He was also, by the numbers, straight, ramrod up his ass military, which meant he wouldn't appreciate her volunteering to share her insights. But if she could work it into the body of a report later... The gabble of voices on the radio was suddenly drowned out by a raw, agonized scream that cut off with a grisly, wet, gurgling noise. Sophira froze, stared at the radio, then her eyes swiveled to the screen, which was now divided into quadrants, showing 4 separate locations all bobbing up and down or shaking from the movement of the guy wearing them. The squad leader's voice cut through all the others, demanding a call-in from everyone. Automatically, she started to reach for the radio, paused to wonder if she really needed to add to the cacophony, and then decided she had to let the guy know they still had a ride back. Not that it took a whole lot of skill to drive the van, which was why she had been surprised when Cosgrove had ordered her off the front gate and into the driver's seat. A bit unusual, considering she had probably had more interaction with the demonstrators than anyone else on the front gate. She had actually expected him to put her in charge of the demonstrators. But as he had explained to her, there was a chance that the murderous trespasser was one of them. If so, she would be more familiar with him or her than any of the other guards. That made sense, she supposed, but she still wasn't sure that behind the wheel of the van was really the best place for her to be. "Oh, shit!" a voice blared from the radio, causing all the other voices to die down. Sophira immediately recognized the speaker as Mo Keller, with no little surprise. Mo was another ramrod and not given to lapses in comm protocol. "Lou, I found Dino. He's... The 4-way split on the dashboard screen was replaced by the transmission from Mo Keller's cam. "No," Sophira mouthed silently, unable to look away from the scatter of human body parts on the ground. All at once the image seemed to give a jump or a flicker, and she realized that the pieces had not been scattered randomly, but arranged to form a gory arrow, although she didn't know what it was pointing at. "Keller to squad leader. We have a man down in section G6 on grid," Mo Keller added suddenly in an eerily calm voice as if she hadn't said anything else before. "Strong indications that the intruder is heading north, possibly with intent to exit woods and proceed to power station." Pause. Over. Keller, this is squad leader. Copy that. Proceed to vehicle and wait for further orders. Pause. Visual received. Cancel general override in your transmission. Over. Wilco, as soon as I receive verification of receipt from all intended targets. Over. The quiet madness in Keller's voice made Saphira's stomach do a slow forward roll. Somebody go get her, she pleaded silently. The squad leader didn't miss a beat, replying as if this was nothing more than a drill. Copy that, Keller. This is your confirmation of general receipt. Permission to end transmission granted. There was a long moment of silence before he spoke again, this time very gently. Everybody saw it, Mo. You can turn it off now. A new voice pipped up. Barra to squad leader, I am currently at grid point G6 rendering aid to Officer Keller. Also present are Fowler, Flower, and Farrell. Fowler, Flower, and Farrell. Sounds like a eco-warrior law firm, Sophia thought as the image from Keller's camera disappeared and the four-way split screen returned, the display in each window changing every few seconds. The general chatter on the radio had barely resumed, however, before there was more shouting and yelling from several people at once, this time followed by the roar of weapons fire. But this time, Sophia didn't need the radio to hear it. Slinging the weapon on her left, crosswise over her shoulder, she grabbed the other and dived through the passenger side door practically all in one uninterrupted motion, landing on the ground in prone firing position. 20 feet ahead of her, the surface of a small lagoon-like section of Veronica Lake seemed to be shuddering in sympathy with the weapon's fire and the screams coming from somewhere beyond a cluster of slender, prickly birch trees and poisonberry bushes. Abruptly, a volley of kill shot tore through the leaves and branches. Reflexively, Sophia ducked, watching as the line of fire moved from right to left through the trees, slanting upward until the shooter was firing into the air. She started to raise her head and flattened again when she heard more firing. No kill shot came through the trees in her direction this time, but her relief was quickly replaced by worry at the sudden new smell in the air. The trees that the kill shot had torn through were now on fire. Sophia, the squad leader, she yelled. We're on fire here. Repeat, we're on fire. I know that, Sophia. Shut up and hold your position, the squad leader snapped. Cease fire! Cease fire! Who the fuck is using incendiary load? Someone burst out from behind the trees, but Sophia could not tell who it was. Every inch of the struggling, flailing figure was covered with flames. The lake! Straight ahead of you! Get in! She screamed. The burning figure gave no sign of having heard her, but whoever it was began stumbling towards the water. Just as Sophia got to her feet, intending to get over there and help, the figure fell face first into the lake. She slung her weapon over her right shoulder and called out that she was coming to get him. But before she could take a step, a new figure suddenly stepped out of the flames, and she stopped dead in her tracks. This figure was not on fire. Didn't seem to be even slightly singed, and from the way he was walking, Sophia got the impression he wasn't even particularly warm. Fireproof suit, she thought, then dismissed that idea immediately. What he was wearing didn't bear even a passing resemblance to the anti-inferno gear they had. In fact, she had never seen anything like this guy's outfit. The way he was moving, it looked like it was painted on, or like it had grown right over his skin, or instead of his skin. He stopped in front of the poisonberry bushes, which were really starting to burn now. That had to be one more than outstanding suit, Sophia thought. Otherwise, his ass would already have passed the delicate golden brown stage and be well on its way to char grilled. Then her gaze found his face, and it seemed to snap it into focus for her almost as if she were seeing it through the lens of a body cam. But only for a moment. Suddenly, she was racked with a violent coughing fit, and tears were blinding her as they poured out of her eyes and down her face. In spite of that, she had somehow managed to shrug the weapon off her right shoulder and into her hands without even thinking about it. You! Step forward 5 paces towards the water's edge and stop, she bellowed, red dotting the center of his torso. Now, or I'll shoot. The bizarre metal gargoyle face looked down at the laser light and then back up at her. No language problem, apparently. Now she had to find out just how bughouse a son of a bitch really was. There was no doubt in her mind that this was the homicidal maniac they were chasing. She would have been certain of it even if he hadn't been carrying a blood-drenched machete as long as her arm. She hefted her weapon, empathically, as if she were getting ready to fire. He moved toward the lake as she had told him, but instead of stopping at 5 paces, he went all the way to the edge of the lake and stood over the corpse of the soldier still lying face down in the shallow water. "That's far enough," Sophia bellowed at him. "Don't move, don't even twitch." The still gargoyle face tilted to one side with a bizarre suggestion of mild curiosity. Then the figure put one foot on the corpse in a bracing position, bent down, and tore one of its legs off. Without hesitating, Sophia opened fire, giving him a 5-second burst, and then stopped to wipe her eyes. The smoke was getting worse, but she was able to clear her eyes well enough to see him standing there, holding that machete in one hand and the charred leg in the other, still staring at her with his head tilted to one side, as if nothing had happened. Then she heard a sound like a giant fist slamming into the earth. Sophia felt herself lifted off her feet and flung backwards. The last thing she saw were burgeoning storm clouds of fire surging towards her, as if they were chasing her on purpose, swallowing up everything as they went, even setting the air itself aflame. "Okay, where are you, Bowes? You can't still be out at the power station." Lynn smiled at the sound of Waxy's irritated growl. "As a matter of fact, boss, that's exactly where I am," she said. "And you can probably tell I've got you on speakerphone. I'm sitting here with Dr. Olson and 2 of his employees pretending to admire the fancy indoor waterfall." Waxy didn't answer right away. "Does the quaint, old term nonplussed mean anything to you?" he said finally. "Indeed," said Olson. "And you're not alone." "Dr. Olson, I presume," said Waxy. "I apologize for the voice-only connection, Mr. Anschutz. It makes it difficult, if not impossible, to introduce Dr. Kai and Dr. Shabazz, who are also present." "Charmed, I'm sure. Picture me bowing. The audio's coming through very well, and I'm pretty sure that the famous indoor waterfall I can hear in the background." Waxy chuckled slightly. "Is it as pretty as it sounds?" Olson's mouth twitched with annoyance. "I'd like to think so. Mrs. Bowes attempted to contact you covertly, but when we blocked her, she insisted on doing so openly." Waxy hesitated again. "You don't say." "Yeah, they actually refused to let me go to the toilet," Lynn told him. "Untrue," Shabazz blurted defensively. "Mrs. Bowes can go to the laboratory anytime she needs to. She just can't take her phone with her." "Which is why I'm calling instead of texting," Lynn chuckled with no real humor. "I wanted to let you know that I'm going to be a little late getting back." "How late?" Lynn glanced at Olson. "I'm not sure. Just guessing, though. I'd say don't wait up." She all but heard her editor's ears prick up. "Oh? Something wrong out there?" "We have some unwanted visitors on the premises whose intentions seem—" Olson cut off. Lynn wasn't sure whether the look that appeared so fleetingly on his face was disbelief or terror. It lasted only a fraction of a second before he composed himself. It was hardly a hysterical outburst, but Lynn found the sight of even just the momentary loss of control unnerving. The beginnings of fear fluttered faintly behind her breastbone. "Hello?" said Waxy. "Anyone there?" "Hang on, boss. I think something big just happened," Lynn replied, more to see what kind of reaction this would provoke from Olson than as a point of information. But the man seemed not to have heard her. Alarmed, she turned first to Shabazz and then to Kai, who were both failing to look neutral, and in fact looked rather uneasy. "Something big did just happen, didn't it?" Shabazz kept his gaze fixed on Olson, who was still sitting motionless and silent, staring over Kai's left shoulder at something no one else could see. "Dr. Olson!" Lynn prodded, almost yelling. He pushed back from the table and stood up sharply. "I am afraid that circumstances demand we adjourn to a shielded area of the station. Unfortunately, that means you'll have to terminate your discussion with the editor until further notice." Before Lynn could react, he picked up her phone, turned it off, and put it in his pocket. "Hey!" Lynn got up and started after him. She had barely gone 5 steps when a security guard materialized on either side of her and took a hold of her arms. There was nothing rough about the contacts. They didn't manhandle her or treat her like a prisoner, but she knew better than to test them and to see if they would. First-degree burn. An extraordinarily cool and pleasant mist puffed into Rena Saphir's face, barely conscious. She smiled at the way it felt, then stopped as a stinging sensation suddenly spread over her cheeks. But the stinging went away even as she became aware of it, overruled by the burn medication sinking into her skin. "Hear me, Sophira? Wake up. Let me see your eyes." She frowned. The stinging flared up on her forehead now. It began to fade almost immediately, but this time it didn't go away completely. The cool mist touched her skin there, too, and it felt as if there were billions of cold, tiny bubbles bursting all over the area between her hairline and her eyebrows. No, beyond her hairline and within her eyebrows. "Lieutenant Sophira, look at me. That's an order." Her eyes flew open, and she found herself staring up at Cosgrove himself. "Sir?" she asked, bewildered. "Congratulations, Lieutenant," he said grimly. "You're the only one to come out of the woods alive." Sophira struggled to a sitting position and found she was sitting on the grass about 20 yards away from the inferno that had once been the forest surrounding Veronica Lake. How? The word dissolved in a spasm of coughing before she could choke out a question. "How'd you get me out of that?" "I didn't," he said, turning her head toward him and shining a light first in her right eye and then her left. "You came staggering out of the trees right after the explosion. Now open your mouth." "Huh?" she said. Immediately he stuck an inhaler between her lips. "Deep breath now." She obeyed, grimacing at the terrible pain in her chest and windpipe. "Breathe out through your nose," he ordered. "And one more deep breath in. I know it hurts. Suck it up." The pain in her chest began to ease considerably as her throat loosened. "You were on fire," Cosgrove said matter-of-factly. He dropped the inhaler into an open medikit. "Your hair, your uniform. I'm afraid you lost your eyebrows," he added as she put one hand up to her head in shock. "You dropped and rolled to put out the flames. Then you managed to crawl a few feet before you dropped again. You didn't move. I thought you were dead." "I don't remember any of that." Sophira swallowed painfully. "What happened to the van?" she croaked. "Fire?" Cosgrove looked mildly troubled. "No. Somebody got in and took off around the other side of the power station." "Then I'm not the only survivor?" "Yes, you are." Cosgrove shut the medikit and helped her slowly to her feet. "The bios of everyone we sent out are gone." "Then who drove the van?" she asked incredulously, leaning on him. He shook his head. "No idea. He had something over his face. A mask. Can you walk?" A mask? The image of the impossible figure she had just seen before the explosion appeared in her mind. "No," she rasped. "No, I was looking right at him when the blast... No. There must have been 2 of them. Or more terrorists." "Save it till we're back inside." Cosgrove slung her arm over his shoulders and began to help her up the lawn toward the power station. Chapter 6. A lot of the hair on her head had been burned off as well as her eyebrows, and the front of her uniform was scorched in some places, charred in others, and generally covered with soot, which also obscured her nameplate. Here and there on her face were bright red blotches where spray-on topical burn medication had either not yet taken effect or missed altogether, and she had a wild look in her eyes that wasn't as intense now as it was going to be later. All told, she should have been unrecognizable, but Lynn knew her right away. She was looking at Lieutenant Sophira. Whatever Sophira had just lived through certainly hadn't impaired her faculties. "What the fuck is she doing here with them?" Sophira hollered in a gravelly rasp that sounded painful to Lynn. The lieutenant turned from the group of demonstrators in the holding cell to the guard who had been sitting next to Lynn on the sofa and was now standing at attention, looking as if she was really expecting someone to answer. None of the demonstrators said a word. The heavy wire some of them had laced their fingers through made the cell look like an animal cage, especially since there was nothing to sit on inside but the floor. The sofa Lynn had been allowed to share with one of the 3 security guards in the room was so Spartan as to be little more than a thinly padded bench. Not up to the standard of luxury Olsen had been seating her to, but not unacceptable. Shabazz and his human needs gang had probably determined that luxury was completely inappropriate for areas like radioactive shelters and bunkers, and secret lockups. Not that she was locked up. She was sitting on the sofa like a guest, not standing inside a cage, which meant that she was in no way a prisoner here. Absolutely not. Her shoulder bag and her log had been confiscated, but that was only standard procedure in an emergency, and Dr. Olson had merely forgotten to give her phone back. She could remind him later, and he'd just hand it over. It wouldn't work in a shielded zone anyways. And the shielding was for protection, of course, not to keep anyone incommunicado. This was not a lockup. It just had a holding cell in it, and if you thought about it, the cell was really for everyone's protection too, including the people inside it. Yes, indeedy do. It was all safe, and everybody was safe, and damn, it sure was great to be alive in an era that was so safe, wasn't it? When Sophia had come striding in, scorched and breathless, and very much the worse for wear, Lynn had felt so insanely glad that someone had finally dispensed with the whole ultra-civilized, everything's-under-control charade that she could have jumped up and kissed her. For that matter, why the fuck are they still here? Sophia looked over her shoulder at the two guards by the door, then turned back to the other guard. Evacuate all these people immediately. Get them out of the building now. That's an order. The guard didn't move. Yes, ma'am, but what about her? Sophia peered around him to look at Lynn. I said all these people, mister. Now do it. The guard made a move towards the holding cell and then hesitated. Ma'am, the chief's orders. I'm giving you the chief's new orders. Unlock that cell. Does the chief want these people in custody after evacuation, ma'am? Asked one of the guards at the door. All right, listen up, everybody, because this is the last time I'm going to tell you, Sophia said. That ragged rasp of a voice wasn't going to last much longer. She sounded like someone had sandblasted her throat. Lynn thought, unconsciously putting a hand up to her own neck. Get every civilian in this room out of the building, off the premises, and as far away from here as possible. You three. You take them to the parking lot and load them into the first transport you see. You two, get back here on the double. While you, she pointed at the guard, and only you, get behind the wheel and drive without stopping until further notice. The guard started to say something else, and Sophia actually drew her sidearm. You have your orders. All three guards scrambled to obey without further discussion. Lynn stood up and cleared her throat. Lieutenant Sophia? Sophia whirled on her with her sidearm. I am trying to save your life, but I swear to God I will shoot anyone who doesn't do what I tell them. The lieutenant's finger shifted slightly. Lynn looked down at herself and saw that a small red dot had suddenly appeared in the center of her chest. I'm packing incendiary load in this thing thanks to some skinbag down in weapons who decided we'd all be safer if we set fire to everything we shot at, Sophia added. So it won't be pretty or survivable. You copy that, citizen? Lynn had no voice to answer. Sophia's threatening croak seemed to be coming from a long distance away, somewhere on the other side of the panic that had frozen over her. Then all at once the lieutenant was practically nose to nose with her. Lynn could see the residue of burn medication on her skin and smell her scorched uniform and burned hair. Come on, you! Snap out of it! Sophia grabbed her upper arm and gave it a quick, emphatic shake before pulling her close enough to put her lips to Lynn's ears. Get up on your hind legs or you will die, she added, speaking with far less iron in her tone now. She dug around in her trouser pocket suddenly and produced a tiny red tablet. That's just how things are now. Eat this, it'll help. Don't argue with me, I'm not making the rules. Lynn did as she was told. Sophia turned away from her and went over to where the demonstrators were huddling together near the door. How many we got here? 7? 8? She counted them using the barrel of her sidearm, ignoring the way each one flinched. 8. I could have sworn there were more of you. One of the demonstrators started to say something, and cut off when Sophia waved her weapon at him sharply. Yeah, I know, there were more of you. I meant even more than that. She beckoned to Lynn without looking at her. Okay, listen up. You stay together, follow these gals out to the parking lot, and then you hit the road. No stops. You got to pee or anything? You'll find receptacles under the seats. If you want to eat, tough shit. I just put you on a diet. You get tired, go to sleep. And trust me on this, the military will be watching after you leave here. That means if you fuck with the driver in any way, or if you fuck up the driver, you'll find yourself in a military prison on terrorist charges, and good luck getting a trial. She yanked open the door. Now get the fuck out of here. They never got near the parking lot. They never even got out of the building. When a step saw the van suddenly pull around in a wide half circle and drive off while Sophia lay unconscious several feet away, He double-checked to see if the sensor readings had somehow been faulty, and someone else from the security team besides the lieutenant was still alive. He knew better, but he did it anyway, unable to shake the superstitious dread that if he didn't double-check, he would find out that one of the other guys actually had survived the conflagration after all, only to suffer an even ghastlier and more pointless death. Oh man, what a lousy fucking day. They were barely into this emergency and already the woods were burning down. A dozen guys were dead, and they still didn't know who was kicking their asses. Had to be whoever commandeered the van. They'd managed to climb in without showing themselves. And shit, now that he thought of it, how many of them were there? And how the fuck had they gotten out of the woods alive? Whoever they were, they had to be pros. They couldn't have been in the group of oversexed, nature-loving rope smokers with Mara. She would have made them right off, and vice versa, which wouldn't have turned out too good. Not that anything had turned out too good anyways. But at least Sophia made it, he thought, watching on one of the monitors as Cosgrove brought her in. Didn't make it any less of a fucking lousy day, though. And it was only gonna get... Every alarm in the building went off at once. A step blinked. The screens on his console were now showing areas inside the power station. "Enemy in the house," said a voice in his comm tensely. "Repeat, enemy in the house." "Copy that," came the reply from Cosgrove. "All personnel to meeting points. Shoot to kill." Training took over immediately. A step sidearm was live in his hand before he was even aware of the excitement surging in his chest and kicking his heart into double time. "How many are there?" he asked, addressing no one in particular, and the world in general. Several other voices echoed a Step's question, but no answer came. Not then, and not ever. As soon as he had seen the truck, the nanomechanisms had sprung to a higher level of activity inside of him, guiding his hands and feet so that he could control it. If the nanos had not been inside him, he would have simply walked past the thing. But they had told him what to do, made his body know the movements. Once he got it going, he understood he could take it around to the other side of the building, where there were entrances which would have been more difficult to get through if he had been subject to the same limitations as the living. The nanos had made him understand that he needed to get inside, and not only because there were living things in there to kill. The energy that had been present in the water, that had awakened the nanomechanisms, stimulated them to reproduce themselves, and so rebuild him. That energy was also inside the building in a concentration, thousands, even millions of times stronger than what was in the dark depths of the lake. The nanos wanted it. Wanted as much as they could get. Wanted it all. For themselves and for him. Using it, they would be able to modify him further, so that he could accommodate the energy within himself, thus carrying his own, virtually inexhaustible power source. Then there would always be something for the nanos to draw on. Combined with his own regenerative abilities, it would mean that he would remain completely uninjured, unimpaired, and undiminished, no matter what happened. Nothing, not even a long fall from the pinnacle of heaven all the way through the atmosphere and into the mud, could ever hurt him in any way, ever again. The door was several inches thick, with a core of material designed to absorb and dissipate the force from an impact. There was a limit as to how much force it could handle, however, and in his present form, Jason Voorhees was capable of delivering all that and more. But as he drew back his arm, the nanos in his system surged with more new information. All at once he was watching, as instead of punching through the barrier, he touched his fingertips to it lightly, as if he were testing the surface to see if it were actually solid. Then he was watching as his fingers sank into the door, up to the second knuckle. His head tilted to one side with an amazement that an observer would have found bizarrely childlike in some ways. Perhaps it was. Factor in the atavistic, innocent heartlessness that even the most well-adjusted children can and do regress to from time to time, and Jason Voorhees was, at that moment, the essence of the term childlike. Meanwhile, the nanos were showing him how they could rearrange matter to accommodate him in any way he liked. In this case, they could allow him to pass through the barrier in such a manner so as not to alert any of the live creatures inside. Eventually, he would be discovered and someone would raise the alarm, but entering the building in secret would delay that. It would not be accurate to say that Jason was considering this as he watched his hand sink further into the door. He still had little in the way of higher brain function, and the nanos would never enhance that part of him. Instinct was closer to it, but not instinct that was in any way related to life. He was anti-life, murder, and destruction now. Instinct told him that although oozing through a barrier like this might turn out to be useful, it was not murder and destruction. He yanked his hand back and kicked down the door. Instantly, sirens were screaming every audible off-key note, as well as others which he knew were inaudible to live humans. But the noise washed over him with little effect. It did not matter whether humans were screaming or if their machines were screaming for them, or as sometimes happened, both. Screaming was inevitably followed by life ending. At the moment, however, he was dominated by the pull of highly agitated nanos towards the power source, and the sense of highly agitated life forms rushing at him from several directions at once. He more or less walked over the first group of live humans as he encountered them. Some fell under him immediately, their bodies crunching and squishing with every step he took. The rest fell back, and some of them ended up under his feet anyway, while others ran. As always, their weapons were no good against him. As always, they fired on him anyways, as though they were convinced that if they persevered, something would change. In fact, something had changed, but not what they had wanted or expected. Jason's body was now absorbing a certain percentage of the incendiary shot that one of the less than savvy armory grunts had loaded so many of the weapons with. It deflected only what it needed to, and the nanos made use of the extra energy and materials. The process was not perceptible to the naked eye, and even if it had been, it probably would have taken a very long time for anyone to notice under the circumstances. Jason himself didn't know exactly what was happening. All he knew was that the more they fired at him, the stronger he became. He waded into them, marching over them, swung his machete from side to side, and swept the pieces out of his way. The humans started to look smaller to him after a while, as if he were actually growing as he made his way through the corridors, to open areas, down stairways and across terraces and mezzanines, mowing down the ones in front of him, shrugging off those who flung themselves at him from behind or sprang out of hiding to lunge at him. The closer he got to the energy source, the more agitated the nanos inside him became, and paradoxically, the less attention he paid to them. He moved in the desired direction, quickly and without delay, crashing through walls if he had to, not caring to wait for the nanos to do it their way. Live things kept coming to him and at him. They fed energy into him, and he crushed them, sliced them, pounded them down, and wiped them out. Many of them were now choking and gagging from the high concentration of chemicals that had built up, as well as the fumes from the fires they had caused, and the stink left behind after the system of emergency nanos put them out, combined with the smell of their own fear and the ominously heavy and horrific odor that was characteristic of massive quantities of blood. There might have been nothing to breathe but panic and death. If it hadn't been for the ventilation system, they might have made it. Lynn had no idea whether damage had knocked it out or whether the entire complex had been sealed off as part of some kind of emergency measure. Not that it would have made a bit of difference one way or the other to the first ones to be affected. She had been slow to notice the smell in the air herself, partly because she was preoccupied with wondering what Sophia had made her swallow, and partly because the odor wasn't all that dissimilar to things she had smelled before in a university science lab. Even after it started to become unpleasantly strong, she hadn't thought much about it. The incessant, deafening alarms bothered her a lot more. Also, the way the security guards had started getting so rough with them, shoving anyone who didn't move quickly enough, threatening to use the stingers. She had actually tried to intervene when they had become a lot more vigorous than necessary with one of the younger people. Just a kid, really. Lynn would have sworn he wasn't old enough to be out of secondary school yet. It wasn't that he seemed frail, but Jesus, the guards had just forced him to run up 6 or 7 flights of stairs, maybe more. Lynn had lost count after 5. Easy enough for them, they were all conditioned. They stayed hard by training for 6 hours before breakfast every day. And they were probably buzz-bombed on a hefty dose of something they weren't supposed to take except in combat. Whereas civilians had lives. She hadn't put it that rudely when she had moved to pull the bellowing guard away from the boy who was down on his hands and knees, whooping and sobbing as he struggled for breath. Or rather, she hadn't intended to put it that rudely, but even if she had, she never got the chance. The moment she had touched the guard's arm, he had rounded on her with frightening swiftness and raised his arm to deliver a backhand blow with the stinger. Putting up one hand in defense, Lynn cried out as she stepped back, stumbled over her own feet, and fell heavily on her side. The guard slammed the stinger down on the floor close enough to send sparks flying into her face. Lynn scrambled up as he began to holler at her and dragged the boy to his feet as quickly as she could, which wasn't really very quickly. The kid hadn't been trying to resist. He just couldn't catch his breath. She tried to tell the guards they needed to stop to catch their breath, but none of them wanted to hear her. As they forced the group of civilians out of the stairwell and into some kind of open area, the boy collapsed altogether, his body jerking and heaving convulsively. Lynn turned to ask the rest of the group if anyone had asthma medication, and saw for the first time that all of them were having some degree of trouble breathing. It took another second before she finally realized that the wheezing sound she had been trying to tune out for quite some time was in fact coming from her. The smell in the air hit her full on, with as much force as a physical blow to her face. Suddenly her eyes were stinging and watering copiously, and the tears pouring down her face seemed to irritate her skin. Masks. She looked pleadingly at each of the guards. No problem for them. They had surgically implanted filters. We need masks. There's no time, insisted one of them. Get going. You'll be out of here before it gets bad enough to... She knelt down next to the boy who was twitching on the carpet. His movements were becoming weaker. He needs... One of the guards shoved her away from him, then stooped to haul him up with one hand and throw him over his shoulder, almost in one smooth motion. Happy now? Move! She started to obey and stopped just before she would have walked right into the back of one of the other demonstrators. He was standing motionless like everyone else, including the other two guards. Lynn turned back to the one carrying the boy, but he was completely still, looking fixedly at something straight ahead. She turned back again, following his gaze. At first she thought the figure standing between them and a now open elevator was simply a higher-ranking guard dressed in some special high-tech gear developed by the military specifically for power station emergencies. A second later she shoved the idea out of her mind. Even if she hadn't noticed the blood and other matter on the long, cruel blade, or seen the way his free hand had been clenching and unclenching with a drive that she somehow recognized as a grotesque combination of hunger and lust, the mask was a dead giveaway. That's no mask, she thought, with the eerie calm of madness. That's his face. Sophia was enraged at the sight of them all just standing there when she burst out of the stairwell. Like a bunch of sheep they were. No, not sheep. Sheep would have been more assertive. They would have started bleeding when the monster came towards them. She gave the ceiling over their heads a 3-second blast just to scatter them. Then she gave the son of a bitch with the machete a good 5 seconds, just to make sure she had his attention. Yeah, I'm talking to you, she croaked. The steel mask tilted to one side, as if he were thinking it over. Then all at once he lunged, not at her, but at the people cowering on his right, and the machete was swinging, rising, falling, swooping. Long trails of blood, vivid and dark, flew through the air and painted the walls, the ceiling, the floor, with streaks and spatters, gory hieroglyphics left by the condemned, the dying and the dead, courtesy of their killer. Sophia kept blasting away at him, at every part of his body. She knew she was hitting him, and in spite of the fact that nothing was changing, she made sure she kept hitting him, trying to shift his attention back to her again, and failing. Trying and failing until there was no movement anywhere around him. Finally he started toward her, and then suddenly changed his mind, if he had a mind, thought Sophia, altering course to a pile of corpses on her left. Sophia blasted him again. When that did not work, she ran after him and flung herself into the air, aiming to hit the back of his neck first. She remembered very clearly thinking that she had to get back on her feet before he did, or she wouldn't have a chance. She also remembered just as clearly how he didn't go down when she bounced off. He turned around to look at her, moving in no particular hurry, as she converted her fall to an acrobat's roll, making use of the momentum to spring back up to a standing position. She gave him another 2-second blast, confining it to his face. God damn you rat fuck bastard, she said to him. What do I have to do to get you to come after me? Stripped naked? He seemed to be wavering, which sent Sophia's fury ratcheting up another notch. Okay, asshole, you asked for it. Slinging her weapon, she took a fistful of uniform in either hand and ripped it apart. She was completely unprepared for his reaction. It had been an insane, silly, and incredibly stupid thing to do. Even as she did it, she wondered if a lack of oxygen combined with trauma had caused her to have a psychotic break. She had expected him to turn away so that she would have to follow him, firing more rounds until she got him to turn back to her again. Instead, his whole body seemed to bristle or spasm in some way, as if he had suddenly been hit by a bolt of lightning, and instead of knocking him out, it had energized him. Even his eyes seemed to blaze more brightly within the dark holes of the mask, and the murderous fury and hatred, Sophia could see in them, struck her with such force that she raised her weapon again. Then he went for her. "Okay, asshole, that's more like it." She danced away from him toward the stairwell, firing her weapon while she shed her ripped shirt. "If I'd known your tastes were that simple, I'd have done this ages ago." She flung the shirt at him and fled down the stairwell, which seemed to infuriate him even more. But despite the fact that she could practically feel the rage coming off of him like waves of poisonous gas, he never made a sound. Not even a wordless, incoherent roar. Not even a grunt of effort. Like the son of a bitch didn't have to breathe. Still, there was no mistaking the force of the homicidal hatred he had for her. As if she was an unspeakable and unforgivable offense to him, merely because she existed. Whatever his problem was, he was also starting to gain on her. If she wanted to stay alive and keep offending him, she was going to have to haul ass like she had never hauled ass before. And still, he continued to gain on her. God damn! But she was getting the very strong feeling that doing that thing with her shirt had been a really, really, really bad idea. Fumes, she thought. She must have been crazy from the fumes. Okay, this has been chapters 5 and 6 of Jason X the Experiment. I'm sorry I wasn't able to put out 3 chapters today like I promised. I am having kind of a medical problem. I'm in a lot of pain right now. I'm doing the best I can. I'll be back tomorrow with some more chapters. Until then, thanks for listening.